April 10, 1943. In the humid dawn over Bougainville's jungle-lined airstrip, a hand-picked squadron of American pilots circled the captured aircraft for the first time, eyes widening at the massive twin-engine bomber they now controlled, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty. They stepped up warily, fingers resting on their holstered pistols, expecting a trap. What they discovered instead was a story of design choices and risk: fuel tanks unprotected, armor absent, a bomber built to run far and fast, not to survive. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific War had entered its brutal, attritional phase. The vast distances of island-hopping operations demanded aircraft with extraordinary range, and the Japanese Navy's long-range bomber program had matured into the G4M, designed by the Mitsubishi Aircraft Company under lead engineer Kiro Honjo. It was intended to replace the earlier G3M Nell with greater speed, payload, and endurance. The strategic need was clear. The Japanese Empire spanned thousands of nautical miles of ocean, and the naval air arm required a platform capable of striking across that domain. Range was king. Yet, as engineers began to balance weight, fuel, armament, and protection, they made sacrifices that would later prove lethal. The G4M entered service in 1941 with fanfare, long legs, twin engines, a torpedo capability, and a sleek form. But among Allied intelligence reports and captured wrecks, a recurring phenomenon emerged. These bombers burned fiercely when hit. Allied crews called it the Flying Lighter. The name whispered with both awe and horror. Why did this bomber, so well designed for its mission profile, become so vulnerable to enemy fire? That is the question the American pilots on Bougainville set out to answer. The G4M in question had been captured on a forward Japanese airfield. Its crew surrendered, their faces hollow with defeat. U.S. engineers escorted the American pilots to inspect the machine. Captain Robert Keller of the USAF later recalled the moment. "We walked around that Betty like it was a dead animal, beautiful lines, but you just knew something deadly lurked beneath." On the ramp, the engines were draped in protective covers, the twin Mitsubishi Kinsei radial silent. The wings had been stripped of camouflage paint in captivity, revealing pale aluminum. The Americans noted fuel stains around the wing roots, the smell of gasoline still potent. Lieutenant Joe Martinez peered into the wing bay. "We opened a panel, and you could see that the fuel cells were part of the wing structure. No separate bags, no thick armor plating." It wasn't merely suspicion. After removing the panel, they found the internal tanks were shallow, wrapped inside the wing spars, and lacking any self-sealing lining or rubber bladders that might slow a leak or burst. Their eyes met in silent shock. The fuel system was exposed. One veteran engineer muttered under his breath, "No wonder they went up so fast when hit." Stepping into the fuselage, the Americans mapped out the crew positions. Forward, the pilot and co-pilot sat in tandem. Behind them lay the navigator, bombardier, radio operator, dorsal gunner, waist gunners, and tail gunner, a full crew of 7. The cockpit felt cramped but efficient. Instruments were in Japanese markings, dials for torpedo release, bomb bay doors, and fuel management. What stood out was the lack of heavy armor plating behind the pilot seats, the absence of thick bulletproof glass in the canopy, and no visible self-sealing features around the fuel cells. American engineers confirmed the wings were essentially wet wings. The tanks formed part of the wing's internal structure. In theory, the bomber had a respectable bomb or torpedo load and an impressive range. One figure cited over 3,250 miles in early versions. But for the crews flying it in combat, the promise of endurance came with a price. Many pilots later gave testimony that engine hits or even small-caliber shell strikes would ignite the wing tanks instantly. One Japanese survivor said, "One burst and the wings glowed orange. You knew you had 20 seconds, maybe 10. Inside the radio compartment, cables ran in orderly fashion, yet the overall refuge felt fragile. In normal cruise over the Pacific, the aircraft could make long distances. But once in combat, its weaknesses became apparent. The Americans, looking at the data, asked themselves how a modern bomber could be so vulnerable to fire. The turning point came when the Americans took a short engine run-up in the captured G4M. They were allowed to taxi at a few hundred yards under the supervision of Japanese mechanics, who still remained under guard. As one pilot slid into the co-pilot's seat, he looked over his shoulder at the tail gunner's position and said quietly, "If I was sitting back there, I'd be praying." The Japanese crew, watching, had solemn looks. They knew the truth. A Japanese airman later offered this. When the Americans started using 20mm cannon and our Zeros lost the sky domination, we realized our bombers were no longer safe. The enemy fighters could stay with us, and the wings would ignite. That realization shook the Americans. Over a lunch briefing, Lieutenant Martinez's voice wavered. "We always thought Japanese aircraft were light, but you just don't build a bomber without protected fuel tanks and armor in 1943. They built this for one thing: range. They took everything else out." Engineers explained the trade-offs. To get range, weight had to be saved. Armor and self-sealing tanks add significant weight, and the Japanese specification prioritized reach. The Americans compared this to their own bombers and fighters, which by 1943 routinely featured self-sealing tanks and armor plating. The contrast was stark. One of the Japanese mechanics muttered, "We were told to fly fast, far, strike deep. Survive? That was left to us." As the Americans stood beneath the wing, one of them touched the thin skin and remarked, "If a .50 caliber hit right here, that fuel cell's going to scream." And indeed, the tank structure lacked even the rudimentary self-sealing bladders that had saved so many Allied airmen. In the weeks that followed, the captured G4M became a classroom. One afternoon, Major Harold Langford gathered the pilots and engineers around the wing route and said, "Let's walk through a hit scenario." He described a frontal fighter attack, hits in the wing fuel cell, a burst of flame, loss of control, ditching in the sea. Corporal Takashi Ito, a captured Japanese crewman serving as interpreter, stood off to the side, hands clasped. He had served in a G4M unit in Rabaul and had flown 9 missions before being shot down. He recalled softly, "We loved the aircraft. She had great legs. We thought we were safe because we could put distance between us and the enemy. But once the enemy fighters caught us, she betrayed us. I lost 2 friends in a single raid. They were sitting at the waist guns. The shells punched into the wing tank boom." In a small briefing room, the Americans showed photographs of charred G4MS, bodies of Japanese crews found in burnt cockpits. One pilot looked away. Major Langford cleared his throat. "Look at this photo. You'll see the wing is intact, but all around it is burned away. That's not an engine fire. That's a fuel tank going up." The Japanese technicians remained silent, but later over tea one of them said quietly, "We were told we did not need armor. The fighters would protect us. The range would win the day. We trusted that. We were wrong." For the American crews, this was more than an engineering lesson. It became a metaphor. Every aircraft is the sum of its design philosophy, its mission, its compromises. And here was a bomber that chose range above survival. As the sun set over Bougainville, the captured G4M sat silent on the runway, its engines cold, its intricate systems now cataloged and tested. The American pilots who had walked around her came away with a sobering conclusion. The bomber had delivered impressive early successes, especially when Japanese tactics encountered unescorted targets. But as Allied fighter coverage improved and anti-aircraft defenses hardened, the design's vulnerabilities proved fatal. In the broader story of the Pacific War, the G4M stands as a cautionary tale, a majestic, long-range machine that gave its crews reach but left them exposed to fire, to abandonment, to defeat. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks and armor was not a mere oversight. It was a strategic choice, one made under the logic of Japan's early war expansion. But war is a harsh teacher, and when attrition took hold, that logic failed. In the cockpit of that captured Betty, the American pilot greeted a series of switches and levers, checked the fuel gauge, traced the wing spars, and located the unprotected fuel cells. He thought not of glory, but of fragility. How a few rounds, a burst of flame, could end everything. The bomber which had seemed unstoppable during the early war now lay exposed, silent, a testament to what happens when speed and range are pursued at the cost of protection. And so, as the night air settled over the Pacific runway, The story of the G4M was etched not just in steel and canvas, but in sacrifice and decision, lessons learned in fire and loss. In the end, the great wings that stretched across the ocean also stretched the limits of what a bomber could endure. April 10th, 1943. The air was thick with uncertainty as those American pilots stepped onto the wings of a captured enemy bomber. They expected a trophy. What they found was a lesson in vulnerability.